The rain had just cleared when officers reached the mangled car at the bottom of the ditch. The driver was pulled out, barely alive. But one thing stood out. The police K9 refused to leave the wreck. He stayed locked on the passenger side, barking at the twisted floorboard. At first, officers thought it was nothing, but when they pried it open, what they found inside changed everything. So what was hidden under that floorboard that left hardened officers frozen in shock? Here's the full story. But before we jump in, drop your favorite memory with a police dog in the comments and make sure you hit that subscribe button. The night had been long for the highway patrol. The rain had not stopped for hours, and the slick pavement made every stretch of road a potential disaster. Emergency calls had been pouring in, spun vehicles, minor collisions, abandoned cars left stranded on shoulders. But when the call came about a wreck off the interstate near the old service road, the tone carried more urgency than the rest. It was not just another wreck. Dispatch noted that a K9 unit was already on scene, and the handler had reported strange behavior from his partner. The car had plowed through a guardrail and tumbled into a shallow ditch, its front end crumpled and windshield shattered. Headlights flickered weakly, casting eerie beams against the soaked earth. The rain had eased by the time more officers arrived, but the storm had left behind an unnatural quiet. All that could be heard was the low hum of idling engines and the insistent barking of the K9. Ruger, a German shepherd known in the department for his sharp instincts, refused to leave the mangled vehicle. His handler had tried to guide him away after the crash site was secured, but the dog planted himself beside the front passenger door, muscles stiff, nose pressed against the cracked frame. His barks were not frantic but focused, as if he knew something inside demanded attention. Officers had pulled the driver out minutes earlier. The man had survived, though barely, and had been rushed to the hospital unconscious. No one else had been seen inside the car, at least not at first glance. The rainwater pooled along the ditch, reflecting flashes of red and blue lights from the patrol cars above. The air smelled of oil, wet asphalt, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Yet Ruger stayed locked on the vehicle, eyes sharp, ears upright. Something inside that floorboard, something hidden in the twisted wreckage, had his undivided focus. Officers exchanged uncertain looks. They had run through the checklist, no passengers, no weapons in sight, no suspicious packages. But Ruger had never been wrong before. His alerts had led to missing children, hidden narcotics, even weapons tucked away in impossible places. He did not waste energy on false signals. As a tow truck was called to prepare for removal, the officers decided to hold back. Instead of rushing, they began scanning the wreck more carefully. Every angle, every compartment. The trunk revealed nothing unusual, just scattered clothes and broken glass. The back seat was crushed inward, cushions soaked through from the rain. But the dog would not budge from the front passenger floorboard, paws pressed to the muddy frame, growls low and steady. There was a question hanging in the air that no one voiced but everyone felt. What could possibly be inside? The floorboard was a mangled mess, the carpeting ripped, metal twisted. It did not appear large enough to conceal anything significant. Yet the intensity of Ruger's alert left no doubt. The handler crouched to examine, brushing away shards of glass and fragments of plastic. Beneath the tangle, the flooring dipped unnaturally. A gap. Maybe an aftermarket modification, a hidden compartment. The kind smugglers sometimes used. But why in a car like this? The wrecked sedan was old, a mid-range vehicle with faded paint and worn seats, not the kind often linked to trafficking or contraband. Still, the gap was there. Small but deliberate. The handler felt his pulse quicken as he tapped along the edge. It gave a hollow echo, different from the rest of the frame. Ruger's barks intensified, echoing against the ditch walls. The other officers gathered closer, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the night. Each step seemed to draw them into a deeper puzzle. Why was the driver unconscious but alone? Why would this car have a hidden compartment? And why was Ruger so relentless about what lay inside? The questions piled on, pressing with weight. Yet no answers came. The handler reached for a pry tool, wedging it into the warped edge of the floorboard. Metal groaned as he forced it upward. Water trickled into the space, mixing with oil and dirt. Ruger lunged forward, sniffing frantically at the opening as if urging them on. Something was indeed beneath the surface, but it was not immediately visible, just shadows. The officers hesitated. Whatever was down there, it was not meant to be found. The sound of the pry bar straining against rusted bolts filled the night. Piece by piece, the compartment began to give way. The first corner lifted, then another, until at last the hidden floor opened just enough to reveal what lay inside. The handler froze. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the shape pressed against the compartment. Small, fragile, a hand, pale and unmoving. The air thickened as realization settled in. The officers, hardened by years of grim discovery, stood in stunned silence. None spoke. Ruger stopped barking now, his body pressed tight against the door, ears twitching but gaze steady. The hand belonged to a child. How could this be possible? No child had been reported in the car, and no seats or belongings in the vehicle hinted at one. Yet here, beneath a concealed floorboard, was undeniable evidence of someone too small to belong there. The handler forced himself to act, widening the compartment with urgent force. The cover tore back, exposing the full scene. It was not just a hand, it was an entire child curled tightly into the compartment, unconscious, covered in dirt and blood. A boy, no older than 7. His tiny frame wedged into the metal cavity, chest rising faintly with breath. Alive but barely. The officers' reactions were immediate. Radios crackled as calls for medics went out. The boy was lifted carefully, his body limp but warm. He was placed onto a blanket away from the wreck, officers shielding him from the cold drizzle. Ruger whined softly, his eyes never leaving the child. The boy was alive. That alone was a miracle. But the mystery only deepened. Why had he been hidden in the floorboard of the car? Who was he? Why was the driver transporting him like that, sealed away, as though meant never to be found? The driver, unconscious at the hospital, suddenly became far more than just another accident victim. He was now the center of something darker, something sinister. But for that moment, the focus was on the child. Officers checked for injuries, scanning for identification, searching the wreck again for clues. A worn stuffed animal was found jammed under the seat, damp and torn. No wallet, no documents, nothing else that could link the boy to anyone. The boy stirred faintly, eyes fluttering but not fully waking. His lips moved without sound, as though trapped in some nightmare too heavy to escape. The handler crouched beside him, Ruger pressed close. The dog sniffed gently at the boy, then lay down as though guarding him. For Ruger, the discovery was not an accident. He had known. The storm had passed, but the night felt heavier now. The wreck was no longer just another accident scene. It was the beginning of a chain of questions that would demand answers. Why was a child hidden like contraband? How long had he been there? And what connection did he have to the driver? The officers glanced at each other, each carrying the same unspoken thought. This was not random. Something much larger had just been uncovered, and it had only been revealed because Ruger refused to move. The boy was taken away by medics, wrapped in blankets, rushed towards safety. But his silent presence lingered in every mind that stood there. The answers would not come tonight, but they would come. They had to, because there was no greater weight than a child found in such a place, and no greater question than why. The tow truck pulled the wreck from the ditch as dawn broke faintly on the horizon. Officers remained, combing the site, searching every inch for more. But nothing else was found. Only that hidden compartment, that impossibly dark secret wedged beneath twisted steel. Ruger finally sat, ears relaxed but eyes watchful, as if his mission was complete. The officers knew better. This was only the beginning. The discovery was a thread, and pulling it would unravel something far deeper. The boy was alive. For now, that was enough. But behind the relief was an edge of dread. Because what they had found in that floorboard was not just a child. It was the doorway to a story none of them were prepared to face. The hospital lights flickered pale against the early dawn. The driver of the wrecked sedan lay sedated in the intensive unit, machines quietly recording every heartbeat. He had suffered head trauma, cracked ribs, and internal bleeding, but none of that drew the focus of the officers who had stayed behind to monitor him. What gripped them instead was the boy, the child who had been pulled from the hidden compartment hours earlier. The boy was alive but unresponsive. He was stabilized, given oxygen, wrapped in warming blankets, and placed under careful observation. Yet he remained still, eyes shut, as if trapped between sleep and something much darker. Nurses whispered that he might wake soon, but no one could predict the extent of his injuries. He had no identification, no belongings except the torn stuffed toy found in the wreck. His silence pressed like a weight on everyone who saw him. The officers who had responded to the crash knew one thing with certainty: this boy had not been placed inside that car floorboard by accident. Someone had hidden him deliberately, locked him into a compartment that seemed designed for secrecy. The driver, unconscious and uncooperative, was now the only possible link to an explanation. Back at the crash site, daylight revealed details that night had hidden. The ditch was muddy, the broken guardrail bent outward like a scar across the roadside. The wrecked sedan was gone, towed to the impound lot for closer examination. Investigators studied skid marks, the angle of impact, and whether the driver had lost control by chance or had swerved intentionally. But the question gnawed deeper: why risk transporting a child like this in the first place? Ruger had been restless since leaving the scene. At the station kennel he paced constantly, his handler watching with concern. The German Shepherd had performed countless searches before, yet his alert at the car had carried unusual intensity. It was as if Ruger had sensed not just a person, but something personal, something urgent that humans could not interpret. His instincts had saved the boy, but they also hinted that the story was far from over. The sedan was stripped apart at the impound yard. Every inch was examined: doors, trunk, seats, and especially the hidden compartment. Investigators found crude welding around the floorboard, a design that looked hand-altered rather than factory-built. Whoever had constructed it knew how to hide something. They also knew how to silence it. The bolts had been lined with foam, muffling any sound from within. It was a compartment not meant for cargo, it was meant for concealment. The discovery stirred memories of past cases: illegal transport, abduction, trafficking. Yet this child was not bound, not gagged, not restrained. He was simply left inside a space too small for survival, if not discovered quickly. Then came the first connecting thread. An officer pulled a scrap of paper from the wreck's glove box. Most of it was soaked and torn, but faint handwriting remained visible. A name, a street address 2 towns away, and beneath it, a note scrawled hastily with only 2 words: "Do not forget." It was not much, but it was something. Officers drove to the listed address. The neighborhood was quiet, a mix of modest houses, trimmed lawns, and rusted mailboxes. The home tied to the wrecked sedan stood out for one reason: the curtains were drawn tight and no sound came from within. The officers knocked, waited, then forced entry after repeated silence. Inside was a scene that deepened the puzzle. The living room was sparse but clean. The kitchen had plates set on the counter, as though someone had left in a hurry. And in the hallway, on a low shelf, sat a framed photograph. It was the boy, the same child now resting in the hospital, smiling in a picture taken long before the bruises and dirt, his hair neater, his eyes bright. He was standing beside a woman whose arms wrapped protectively around his shoulders. No man was in the photograph, no father figure, just the woman and the boy. But there was no sign of them in the house, only the emptiness of absence. The officers searched further, finding clothing in the boy's size in the bedroom closet, drawings taped to the walls, toys tucked beneath the bed. It was undeniably his home, yet the woman was gone. No phone, no purse, no trace of where she had gone. And another detail unsettled them more. The back door showed signs of forced entry, the lock splintered, wood chipped inward. Someone had broken in. Someone had taken the boy. The chain of events grew sharper in focus. The driver of the wrecked car had not just crashed by accident. He had been moving the boy after taking him from this home. But why? Was it a ransom attempt? A custody dispute? Something worse? At the hospital, the boy began to stir. His eyes opened weakly, blinking against the sterile light. He spoke no words, only looked around with confusion. Nurses soothed him, but he seemed disoriented, clutching the stuffed toy tightly when it was returned to him. His silence carried fear, the kind buried deeper than mere injury. Ruger was brought into the hospital room at the handler's request. Some questioned the decision, but the moment the dog entered, the boy's demeanor shifted. He reached out with trembling fingers, touching Ruger's fur, and for the first time since being found, his breathing slowed. His shoulders loosened. It was as if he recognized the dog as his rescuer. A bond began in that instant, unspoken but undeniable. The boy's recovery was fragile, but his presence unlocked a flood of urgency in the investigation. Officers knew now that this was not a random child. They had his home, his belongings, his life etched into photographs and drawings. The missing link was the woman in the picture. His mother, presumed. Where had she gone? Why had the driver taken only the child? The driver regained consciousness briefly the next morning. When questioned, he offered nothing but shallow denials, claiming he remembered little of the crash. But his unease betrayed him. He avoided mention of the child altogether, as if silence could erase the evidence. Sedatives dulled his coherence, but investigators saw enough in his eyes to confirm he was not just a bystander caught in a wreck. He was complicit. Ruger remained a shadow to the investigation, guiding his handler in ways that could not be explained. When taken to the impound yard, Ruger ignored most of the wreck except the trunk. He pawed at the lining until investigators peeled it back, revealing faint traces of fabric fibers and an old receipt crumpled into the corner. The receipt traced to a hardware store on the outskirts of town. The purchase? Steel panels, bolts, and insulation foam. The very materials used to build the hidden compartment. The pieces began to connect, one after another, like threads tightening into a web. The driver had built the compartment. He had broken into the boy's home. He had taken him, hidden him, and was transporting him toward some unknown end when fate intervened in the form of a crash. But the most haunting question remained unsolved. Where was the woman? The house showed no signs of her departure. Her belongings were untouched, her clothes still in the closet, her presence abruptly cut short. The forced entry suggested she had been there when the boy was taken, yet there was no blood, no body, no indication of struggle beyond the broken lock. The mystery was not just about the boy anymore. It was about what had happened to his mother. Ruger's instincts, sharp as ever, were once more called upon. The handler brought him through the boy's neighborhood, allowing him to trail scents along the property lines. The German Shepherd moved steadily, nose to the ground, pulling the lead toward the backyard. He paused at the fence, sniffed the damp earth, then continued toward the alley. His body stiffened, tail rigid. As he stopped before a storm drain near the edge of the street, he barked, low and forceful. Officers pried the grate open, shining flashlights down into the dark tunnel. Mud lined the walls, water trickled faintly, and against the damp surface was something chilling, scraps of torn fabric. A woman's scarf, ripped and muddied. The scarf matched the woman in the photograph. The alley became a crime scene instantly. Evidence was gathered, every trace documented. It was no longer speculation. She had been taken, forced through this path, dragged away under the cover of night. The realization drew the investigation into sharper urgency. This was not one man acting alone. The driver might have been the transporter, but someone else had orchestrated it. Someone had taken the woman while the boy was hidden, and Ruger once again had uncovered the path. The weight of it pressed heavily on the officers. The child had been saved, yes, but the case was far from closed. The wreck was not the end. It was the beginning of unraveling something larger, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The boy slept soundly that night at the hospital, Ruger stationed quietly nearby as if guarding him against shadows. But the unanswered questions loomed large, filling every silence with unease. Where was the mother? Why had they been targeted? And most of all, what lay ahead if the people behind this were not yet stopped? The storm had ended, but the true darkness was only beginning to unfold. The case had begun with a wreck and a dog refusing to move, but it had grown into something far more sinister. By the time daylight settled over the town for the second morning, every officer involved knew this was no ordinary crash investigation. They were dealing with an abduction, possibly organized, with motives still hidden beneath layers of unanswered questions. The boy was recovering slowly in the hospital, though his silence remained unbroken. He clung to the stuffed toy and occasionally to Ruger's thick fur when the K9 was brought in. Nurses noticed how his body eased whenever the German Shepherd sat nearby, how his fear seemed to ebb in those moments. Ruger had become more than just his rescuer. He had become his anchor. The boy's mother, however, remained missing. The scarf found near the storm drain was the only sign she had left behind. No ransom calls had come, no demands, just silence, and the chilling possibility that whoever took her had vanished into the shadows. But Ruger was restless again. His handler noticed it first, the pacing, the stiff posture whenever they passed the impound lot where the wrecked car was kept. Something about the vehicle still gnawed at him, as if not every secret had been uncovered. So the sedan was brought back under inspection. Ruger was allowed to circle freely. His nose brushed across the seats, the trunk, the warped floorboard. Then he stopped at the driver's side door, ears erect, body tense. His paw scratched hard against the panel. Investigators pried it open, pulling away the inner lining. Tucked inside was a plastic sleeve of documents, sealed to resist moisture. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of the boy's home, pages of notes detailing daily routines, when the boy left for school, when the mother left for work, when the lights went out each night. It was a log of their lives, meticulously recorded, and it was not just one man's work. The handwriting varied, some notes written in heavy block letters, others in quick scrawls. More than one person had been watching this family. The evidence shifted the case into an entirely new dimension. This was not random, it was calculated, and one detail in the notes struck everyone cold. The most recent entry read, "Transfer both. Deadline 3 days. The boy had been found." The mother still missing was the second half of the plan. The urgency became absolute. Detectives traced the hardware store receipt Ruger had helped uncover. Surveillance footage showed the driver making the purchase, but he was not alone. Another man stood with him, taller, wearing a baseball cap low over his face. His features were obscured, but his presence confirmed what they had feared. This was bigger than a single suspect. The boy's silence broke at last later that afternoon. Weakly, he whispered a single word while clinging to Ruger. A name, not his own, not his mother's, but a word that sounded like Ray. Detectives seized on it. The name Ray did not match the driver's records, but it did match something else. In the files of prior investigations, there was a known figure by that name linked to underground rings, networks that moved people, not just contraband. He had never been caught. His name was spoken in whispers across jurisdictions, and now it seemed he was here. The search widened. Abandoned warehouses, rural outbuildings, all combed through with urgency. Ruger led multiple sweeps, his nose guiding teams into places they might have overlooked. Each time, small clues appeared. Discarded food wrappers, cigarette butts, traces of recent habitation, but no mother. The breakthrough came from the scarf. Forensics revealed fibers of burlap embedded in the threads, mixed with soil not native to the alley. Cross-matching samples pointed toward an old farm property miles outside of town. Long abandoned but occasionally used by transients, a team was assembled quickly. Ruger rode with his handler, alert and watchful as the convoy rolled down gravel roads toward the property. The farmhouse stood crooked against the sky, its paint peeled, windows boarded. The barn beside it sagged inward, doors chained but not secure. The air was tense. Officers moved carefully, flashlights cutting across the darkness inside. Dust swirled, the smell of old hay and rust filling their lungs. And then Ruger stiffened, his growl low, steady. He pulled hard toward the barn's far corner. There, beneath a tarp weighed down with bricks, was a cellar door. The chains were cut quickly. Officers descended into the stale air below. The beam of a flashlight swept across the space, revealing a figure bound to a chair. A woman, weak but alive. It was the boy's mother. Her eyes widened with relief when she saw uniforms flood the cellar. Tears streaked her dirt-stained face. She had been beaten but not broken, alive, waiting for rescue. The officers freed her, supporting her weight as they carried her upward into the night air. Ruger whined softly, pressing his nose against her hand once she was safe outside. She clutched at him, recognizing in that moment the silent guardian who had saved her child. The farmhouse was searched top to bottom, but the men behind it were gone. Tracks in the dirt showed a hurried escape, tire marks leading away toward back roads. Whoever had orchestrated it had slipped through their grasp again. But their plan had failed. Both mother and child were safe. At the hospital, the reunion was almost too much for words. The boy's eyes lit with recognition the moment his mother entered. He ran into her arms, clinging tightly, sobbing into her shoulder. For the first time since being found, his silence broke into sound, not words, just cries of relief. And for her, the pain of captivity melted in that embrace. They were together again, against all odds. Officers stood quietly nearby, none needing to speak. The moment was enough, and Ruger, sitting close with his handler, watched the reunion with calm eyes. His mission was complete. The investigation did not end that night. Leads were followed, warrants prepared, networks traced. The man called Ray would be hunted relentlessly until captured. But for now, the focus was not on what remained unfinished. It was on what had been saved. A child who would have been lost forever in the hidden floorboard of a wrecked car. A mother who would have disappeared into the shadows of an abandoned cellar. Both alive because one K-9 had refused to move. Weeks later, the department held a ceremony. Officers gathered, families present, the boy and his mother seated quietly in the front row. The chief spoke of dedication, of vigilance, of the extraordinary instincts of a dog who had seen what humans might have missed. Ruger was awarded a medal, his handler praised for their bond. But the true honor came in the simplest gesture. The boy rising from his seat, walking shakily to Ruger, and wrapping small arms around his neck. There were tears in the crowd. The weight of the case, the darkness of what had almost been, all lifted by that single embrace. The story of the wrecked car would not fade quickly. It would be told for years how a child was hidden in plain sight, how a mother was taken, how the truth unraveled piece by piece. But always at the center would be Ruger, the dog who refused to move. He had not just found evidence, he had found life. And in doing so, he had brought light into the darkest of nights. Before you go, remember this was just one incredible story. Imagine the ones you'll miss if you don't hit subscribe. Every new video brings you closer to the next unbelievable K-9 moment. So tap that like button, subscribe now, and don't be the one hearing about it later instead of seeing it first.